Hey everyone, this lesson is going to cover how to write conclusions for your essay. So hopefully if you're watching this video, you have already gone over the handouts and PowerPoints and video lessons for thesis statements and writing introductions. All right, so we covered the beginning of the essay. Now we're going to take a look at how to close the essay. The reason we're skipping the middle is because the introduction is so closely connected to the conclusion, even though they're separated by the body of the essay. We will learn more about how to attack the body of the essay in another week. But for now, we're going to look at, now that we have opened our essay, how are we going to close the essay, right? So if you remember from the handout on introductions and the one on conclusions, they say that the conclusion should be roughly the same length as your introduction, remember? So keep that in mind. If you feel like you're starting to go too far with the conclusion, if it's getting much longer than the introduction, that is a sign. It could be that you're repeating yourself in the conclusion, you're adding new information, or something's going wrong in the conclusion that you need to address. I suppose there's a possibility that it means the intro was not quite as comprehensive and full as it should be. That could be a possibility. But if you keep that, guideline in mind that they should be roughly the same length, then hopefully that will help you make sure that you've got a strong conclusion. So the conclusion, of course, is what ends the essay, right? But what are you supposed to do in the conclusion? Because it's not always easy to know how to stop the essay, right? So we're going to talk about some of the things that you need to make sure you do in your conclusion, a couple of things you want to make sure you don't do in your conclusion, and then we're going to look at a few samples. So it isn't just similar, the conclusion that is, it's not just similar to the introduction in terms of its length, but also in terms of technique, content, and purpose, right? So if you look at the bullet points that are on the writing conclusions handout, it says that your conclusion answers the question posed or provides solutions to the problem that's identified in the introduction by revisiting the thesis, right? So whatever information you included in your introduction, whatever the body of the essay was attempting to do, you have to come back to that in the conclusion. You have to remind us of those things. I always tell students that, and you may have heard this before, that you've got introduction, body paragraphs, conclusion. So the introduction, you're going to tell them what you're going to tell them. The body of the essay is when you're going to tell them, and then the conclusion, you're going to tell them what you just told them. So it sounds very repetitive. It sounds like you're just, constantly saying the same thing. And you kind of are, but that's what creates the lasting impression. That's what makes it stick with them. And you don't want to be repetitive as in like using the same exact words in all of these areas, but simply referencing the same ideas along the way. So in your conclusion, you want to make sure you come back to the information that you included in the introduction, right? It's going to synthesize and highlight the main points from the body of the essay, and then it's going to explain the significance of the whole thing through implications and how to make it relevant. So you're going to remind us of why the essay was important, why the topic was important, what you wanted to do, what you wanted to accomplish, what your main point was, the evidence that you used in the body of the essay to support that viewpoint, and then something about the bigger picture, right? So you want to use your grabber to your advantage here, right? So whatever grabber technique you used, if it was a quote, an anecdote, statistics, a question, come back to that in your conclusion. And I mentioned this at the end of the video lesson on introductions, that the cool thing about those grabber techniques is it sets you up for your conclusion. There is nothing more satisfying than having something come full circle. So you start your introduction with a question, let's say. Come back to that question in the conclusion. Ideally, whatever the question was, you somehow addressed it in the body of the essay. It should have related to your thesis statement, and your thesis statement is what the essay is supposed to be about. So therefore, you should be answering that question in some way. So come back to it in the conclusion. If you told a little story, if there was an anecdote, come back to that story. It builds in a nice foundation for your conclusion, whatever that grabber was. So use it to your advantage. It creates symmetry and closure, and it's especially satisfying for the reader. Remind us of your thesis and your main points. So you don't want to use the same exact wording though, right? And it doesn't even have to be in one sentence the way a thesis statement is. You know, your thesis statement is one sentence at the end of your introduction that tells us what your main point is and previews the main points in your body paragraphs. You don't have to do it that exact in your conclusion, but you somehow want to remind us of that thesis statement in whatever way seems organic and natural to you. So we'll look at some examples. Remind us of your purpose too, right? So that should have been part of your lead-in in your introduction. You grabbed our attention, and then your lead-in should have established why we should care about your topic and what your purpose is in writing the essay. So you want to come back to that in the conclusion as well. Remind us of your purpose, remind us of the significance of your topic by showing how this one aspect of your topic fits into the bigger picture of life, right? That sounds kind of big and dramatic, but it doesn't have to be. But it's just, you know, things don't happen in a vacuum. Everything that we write about, everything we discuss is somehow connected to our lives. So don't just, you know, write a paper that doesn't connect and doesn't show how this one topic fits into the bigger picture, right? So reminding us of your thesis and your main points, reminding us of your purpose, and somehow relating back to that grabber technique to create the symmetry that we look for. Those are all things that your conclusion should accomplish. What you do not want to do in your conclusion, though, is do not introduce any new information or new ideas. The only thing new that should appear in your conclusion is, let's say, for instance, you are writing a paper, some sort of argumentative research paper. Let's say you're doing it on, I don't know, vaccinations or something like that, to take a hot topic. If you are writing a paper that is asking for change or why something should change, then talk about that in the conclusion a little bit, right? Now that you have proven with the body of your essay, you've proven why this change needs to occur, call your readers to action, right? You're going to be writing an evaluation essay for essay number 2, which is where you're going to evaluate something and say whether or not it's good or bad. So in your conclusion there, you're wanting to, you know, prompt your reader to either buy this thing or eat at this place or watch this movie, or don't. Maybe you gave it a bad recommendation, right? But still, you are then taking this essay that's, you know, just by itself, and you are connecting it to something outside of itself. So that's okay to do in the conclusion. It is not okay to introduce more main points or more ideas in the conclusion. That should have been done in the body paragraphs. So if you find yourself in that situation where you have introduced something new in the conclusion, you have a decision to make. Is it important enough to the overall essay that it needs to be talked about? If so, then maybe you need to add in another main point in the body of the essay. If it's not really all that important, then maybe just take it out of the conclusion and let it be. But never have new information or new points to make in the conclusion. That should have all been done in the body of the essay. So you want your conclusion to be somewhat similar to your introduction. Come back to that grabber technique to help you out there. You should probably have the same kind of tone that you had in your introduction. You're going to want to remind us of your thesis statement and your main points and your purpose, right? So let's take a look at some examples here and see if we can use any to our advantage. All right, so going down to the bottom of the second page of the handout, we have some sample conclusions. So the first example, the topic, is why Ross didn't deserve Rachel on Friends, right? So we don't have the introduction, we don't have the rest of the essay, but somehow, some way, in the body of this essay, the author was trying to prove why Ross didn't deserve Rachel. So let's see how they kind of drew it to an end and tied it all together. Although viewers always expected Ross and Rachel to reunite at the end of the series, the fact remains that Ross didn't deserve Rachel as a partner. As we saw in the beginning of the series, Ross was unfaithful to Rachel when they had been dating for over a year, and he didn't want to admit his wrongdoing when they tried to get back together after their initial breakup. That was probably the first main point they discussed. Additionally, Ross was an extremely jealous and demanding partner, yelling at Rachel in front of all their friends on several occasions. That was probably the second main point they discussed. Finally, and most egregiously, Ross had a terrible reaction when Rachel told Ross she was pregnant after Monica and Chandler's wedding, making him an undesirable romantic partner for her or any other character on the show for that matter. So those were probably the three main points discussed in the body paragraphs. So, but probably not with the same exact wording in the body of the paragraph. They are simply reiterating those ideas in the conclusion. This conclusion is especially apparent after viewing the show more than 10 years after the final episode aired and having a collectively better understanding of women's rights and domestic abuse in relationships. So now we took this specific topic of two fictional characters on a TV show and connected it to the bigger picture, right? In real life, we have a better understanding of relationships now and of women's rights and domestic abuse. So it gives us a different perspective, perhaps, on this relationship on that TV show. Probably taking Friends a little too seriously, but I thought it was a decent example. So brought us back to the main points, brought us back to the thesis, connected it to something bigger outside of the essay. It's a really decent conclusion. So the second example here is talking about why sex education should be taught in public schools, right? So again, we don't have the intro, we don't have the body of the essay, but based on what we read in this conclusion, try to figure out what that introduction may have looked like, right? It's clear that sexual education is completely vital to the public school curriculum. Not only does this lead to a better understanding of human development and human sexuality, but awareness in sex education also reduce the rates of teen pregnancy. Studies have shown that comprehensive sexual education increases the age of when teens have sex for the first time. Learning about contraception and how to use contraception correctly ultimately leads to lower rates of STDs. Lastly, comprehensive sex education also teaches students about consensual sex and will hopefully lead to healthier sexual relationships and lower rates of sexual assault in the future. Not only should sex education be taught in public schools, but it should be mandatory for all public school systems. I don't know what evidence they've used in the body of the essay, but I can figure out what main points they talked about. I can understand what their purpose is. I can understand what their main point was, and they have connected it to something outside of this individual essay. So we may not always agree with what the main point is, but it's a good conclusion. It does exactly what a conclusion is supposed to do. So let's take a look at the third example here. So the third example is all about, is an increased dependence on technology good for society? Technology surely isn't going anywhere. If anything, we will become more and more dependent on the capabilities of our smartphones and other devices in the future. However, we have to make sure that this dependence on technology isn't making us lazier or less curious about the world around us. That was probably two of the main points. With more knowledge available than ever before with today's technology, people are less discerning about what kind of materials they read and whether or not those materials are factual. That was probably another main point. People are also less likely to make a personal connection with someone while they're out in the world, which can increase levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. That was probably the fourth main point. Ultimately, we have to learn how to coexist with technology in a way that is both helpful and constructive, right? Again, I can tell that we're at the end of the essay. I can tell what their main points were probably all about. I can tell why it's an important topic, why I should care, and they have connected it to something bigger in the world. So this is what we're striving for. So last example here, should schools start later in the morning? There are some clear benefits to starting school later in the morning for K through 12 students, such as better academic performance and improved sleeping schedules. Although it might take a bit of rearranging schedules for parents to take their kids to school later on in the day, it's more important that students perform better academically than for the drop-off to be convenient for the parents on their way to work. To combat this, increased bus routes and crossing guards should be implemented so that parents who have to get to work at a certain time can be assured that their kids are making it to school safely. All right, so we talked about this problem of why school needs to start later for students K through 12. The main points probably had something to do about better academic performance and improved sleeping schedule. And then they leave us with this final thought, like, more research or more work needs to be done on bus routes and crossing guards, So they're not tackling the solution in this essay. They're offering up a potential idea in the end, but it's almost like that's where we need to focus our attention now. I've already proven to you why this is a good idea and why we should be focusing on it. Now, somebody else needs to, or maybe I'm going to do it too. In another essay, we're going to talk about how to make these changes happen, right? So one thing that I'd like to point out about all four of these examples is notice that not one of them uses words or phrases like finally or in conclusion, right? They have found a way to gracefully move into the conclusion and still make it clear that it is the conclusion, right? Without kind of using one of those expressions. If you can get to that point, then you probably have a really stellar conclusion. If you are still struggling and you're unsure of yourself, if you begin your conclusion by saying something like in conclusion, it's not the worst thing in the world, right? Because if what comes after that phrase does its job, then that's all that really matters. But I want to point out that what you're striving for is something that is organic and natural, where you go from that last body paragraph, slide right into the conclusion, and even though you don't use a signal phrase, your tone and your approach make it clear that we've reached the end of the essay. That's why going back to those techniques from your introduction can help, because if all of a sudden you're coming back to that question you asked in the beginning, that clues me in. Oh, all right, that was it. We're about to wrap this up. So keep all these things in mind. Introduction and conclusion should be roughly the same length. You want to come back to your introduction as the foundation for your conclusion. So come back to that attention grabbing technique. Whatever it is you used in the intro, use it to your advantage and come back to it in the conclusion. You want to make sure you remind us of your thesis statement, the main points of your body paragraphs, and your purpose. And if necessary or if applicable, you want to leave us with some sort of thought, some sort of feeling that connects your specific topic to the bigger picture, okay? I would suggest, I suggested in the other video that you don't always have to work on your introduction first, right? You can come back to it and strengthen it and make it better after you have written the rest of the essay. The conclusion is probably the one thing that will be written at the end, right? It comes at the end of the essay. It'll probably be the last thing you write because you want to make sure that you know exactly what you did in the intro and body paragraphs so that that conclusion is on point. But if you can create that full circle, if you can make it come full circle, give us symmetry and give us closure, your readers are going to be very satisfied and you will have done your job. All right, so you're going to have an assignment working with introductions and conclusions. I explain it in the assignments video, but come back to these PowerPoints and handouts and video lessons if you have any questions about the homework assignment. And then, of course, I'm always here to help you as well.